The world knew Richard Pryor as the fearless comedian who said everything on stage. But one night in 1976, something silenced him for 30 years. It all happened behind the door of a bedroom that was supposed to be locked, at 3 in the morning, at Marlon Brando's mansion on Mulholland Drive. When Pryor came out, his hands were shaking, not from shock, but from disbelief. He had just witnessed something that would shatter Hollywood's most carefully guarded illusion about the price of masculinity, fame, and honesty. What Richard saw that night wasn't a scandal. It was a truth so dangerous that even America's boldest comedian couldn't speak of it aloud until months before his death. If you want to hear this story to the end, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Richard Pryor was at the peak of his career in 1976, but he was falling apart inside. Millions laughed at his jokes about cocaine, women, and street life. No one saw how lonely he really was. The man who said everything on stage couldn't say one truth. He loved men too. In those years, such a confession in Hollywood was career suicide. Fans wouldn't forgive. The industry wouldn't forgive. So Richard put on his mask and became someone else every night, until the night he knocked on Marlon Brando's door. When Brando let him in, he saw something in Richard's eyes, the same exhaustion, the same weight of a masked life. As the two men looked at each other, an understanding was born that needed no words. Brando had carried the same secret for decades, and the weight of it had nearly destroyed him. Marlon Brando was the god of Hollywood in the 1950s. His performance as Stanley Kowalski in A Streetcar Named Desire redefined masculinity: wild, fragile, dangerous, yet equally sensitive. Terry Malloy in On the Waterfront made him a legend. Vito Corleone in The Godfather immortalized him. But beneath all these triumphs lay a hidden struggle. Brando pioneered method acting, a man who delved into the depths of his own soul to live his roles. The problem was, he could never share what he discovered in those depths. His desire for men, his relationship with Christian Clift, the nights he spent with James Dean. In Hollywood, these truths were burdens he had to carry like stones on his back. Brando covered up this secret by having relationships with hundreds of women. He married, divorced, remarried. But the truth inside him never changed. By the 1970s, he was no longer an actor. He was a character playing his life. Richard Pryor hadn't come to Mulholland Drive that night just for a visit. At gatherings held at Brando's house, Hollywood's most powerful names came together, but after a certain hour, only certain people remained. Everyone who stayed shared the same reality, the exhaustion of living a double life. When Pryor entered the door, the mansion's silence enveloped him. Brando was living alone at the time. His children were in different homes, and the massive structure was almost haunted. Marlon took him into the living room, and the two men talked for hours about the pressure of their careers, the hypocrisy of the industry, the truths they could never say. As the night wore on, the words dwindled and the distance between them closed. After 11 o'clock, Brando got up and walked toward the bedroom. Richard followed him. When the door closed, the outside world disappeared. There were only two weary souls there, two men exhausted from playing their roles, who just wanted to be themselves. When the bedroom door opened at 3 in the morning, there was no panic on Richard Pryor's face. There was no shame. There was a deep understanding in his eyes, the feeling that someone finally understood him completely. Brando was still inside, and Richard walked silently through the house's corridors toward the exit door. As he got into his car, he noticed his hands trembling slightly, but it wasn't fear. It was the tremor of relief at being able to take off his mask for the first time in years. As he drove home, only one thought crossed his mind. He couldn't share this truth with anyone. In Hollywood, some secrets had to be buried in stone tombs, because in those years, this kind of bond between men meant the end of a life, not a career. Pryor entered his home that morning with a promise to keep Marlon's secret and bury his own truth in silence. But the silence began to eat away at Richard from the inside. Now, beneath every joke on stage, lay a hidden pain. While the audience laughed at Pryor's stories about women, drugs, and street life, he carried a completely different story inside. During the filming of the 1977 comedy special Live on the Sunset Strip, he stepped away from the microphone at one point and turned his back to the audience. The camera captured that moment. Richard's shoulders were shaking slightly, and his eyes were distant. When he returned to the stage, he had his usual smile on his face, but those who saw that brief moment understood that something had changed. Pryor was no longer just a comedian. He was also a prisoner of his own life. Over the years, Richard married different women, divorced, remarried. His cocaine addiction nearly killed him. In 1980, he miraculously survived an accident in which he set himself on fire. But in the midst of all this chaos, Marlon Brando was always on his mind. The two rarely saw each other anymore, but there was a silent bond between them. Hollywood's two giants in the public eye were two fragile men, carrying the same secret behind closed doors. Brando's life was also falling apart. His son Christian committed murder. His daughter Cheyenne committed suicide, and Marlon isolated himself from the world by turning to obesity. But neither of them ever spoke of that night in 1976, not until Richard's final days. By 2005, Richard Pryor could no longer speak. Multiple sclerosis had confined him to a wheelchair, and his body was weakening day by day. His wife, Jennifer Lee Pryor, had taken on his care and never left his side during his final days. On a hot June afternoon, Jennifer sat down next to Richard and held his hand. As Richard looked at her, there was deep fatigue in his eyes, but also something else, the weight of unsaid words. Jennifer whispered, "You can tell me everything, Richard. You don't have to hide anymore." At that moment, Richard's lips moved, and Jennifer leaned in closer. The words were almost inaudible, but Jennifer heard everyone. "Marlon, with him, he was beautiful, Jen. For the first time, I could be myself." When Jennifer pulled away, there were tears in her eyes, but no surprise. Richard continued, the words coming out with difficulty, but he needed to pour out his heart. The time had finally come to let go of the burden he had carried for years. That day, Richard told Jennifer about the night in 1976. He talked about the pictures on the walls of Brando's bedroom, the depth of the silence, that brief moment when the two men took off their masks and were just human. "If the world had seen us like that," Richard said, "it would have destroyed us both." But that night, it was worth the destruction, because he was tired of hiding himself for years, of acting, of presenting a different Richard Pryor to everyone. In those brief hours with Marlon, he was his true self, without shame, fearlessly, just Richard. As Jennifer squeezed his hand, she asked, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Richard's eyes turned to the ceiling. "Because some truths are too heavy, and I didn't want to make Marlon's burden any heavier," he was living in the same hell. On December 10, 2005, Richard Pryor died. Hollywood's biggest names gathered at his funeral to pay their respects, but none of them knew Richard's deepest secret. Marlon Brando had died a year earlier in 2004. The two men had quietly left us, and their secrets were buried with them. Until 2018. That year, legendary music producer Quincy Jones made a bombshell statement in an interview. He said Marlon Brando had relationships with names like Richard Pryor, James Baldwin, and Marvin Gaye. The media went wild, but the most striking confirmation came from Jennifer Lee Pryor. Richard's widow released a statement confirming Jones's words. "Richard was always bisexual," said Jennifer. "And yes, he and Marlon Brando were together for a period. Richard told me this before he died. This was his truth, and now the world should know it." This confession rewrote Hollywood history. Two legends, one the father of modern acting, the other the revolutionary of American comedy, had shared a connection no one could have imagined for decades. But this story isn't just about a secret relationship between two famous men. It's about the cruelty of an era, the pressures on identity, and the price of not being able to live as one's true self. In 1970s America, life was a battle for LGBT individuals. Society viewed them as sick, laws deemed them criminals, and the media turned them into monsters. For celebrities, the situation was even more difficult because public image meant everything. A scandal meant not just the end of a career, but social death. Marlon Brando lived with this pressure his entire life. While delving into the depths of characters through method acting, he also discovered his own soul. But he had to hide every truth he discovered. In an interview, he said, "Acting is a lie, but a good lie resembles the truth." His own life had become such a lie, a performance that looked real from the outside but was rotting from the inside. His relationship with Christian Clift, his nights with James Dean, the moments he shared with countless men, all remained locked away in Hollywood's drawers. Brando presented the world with the image of a heterosexual playboy. While his relationships with hundreds of women graced magazine headlines, his true desires remained hidden in the dark. This double life slowly destroyed him. He turned to alcohol, succumbed to obesity, and completely withdrew from society in his final years. The situation was no different for Richard Pryor. The comedian who broke taboos on stage never broke his own biggest taboo. He could joke about his bisexuality. He could talk about his relationships with women, but he could never accept the love he felt for men. This silence gnawed at him. Cocaine addiction, bouts of depression, suicide attempts, all were cries from a suppressed identity. While hospitalized after a fire accident in 1980, he told a reporter, "I tried to destroy myself because I could never fully be myself." But no one understood the true depth of those words. That's why the meeting between the two men in 1976 was so important. That night, they both took off their masks and showed each other their true selves. Far from the pressures of society, the demands of their careers, the expectations of their fans, they simply existed as two human beings. This freedom was short-lived, but unforgettable for Richard. The beauty of this moment, which he recounted to Jennifer on his deathbed, left a smile on his face even in his pain. Because for a moment, he could be completely himself. He could exist as Richard, fearlessly, without shame, alongside Marlon Brando. Jennifer Lee Pryor's 2018 statement was not just a scandalous revelation. It contributed to the liberation of people who had lived under pressure for generations. Richard's story showed that even the bravest-looking people can carry deep secrets within them. Even the strongest performers can be crushed by social pressures. And sometimes true courage lies not on stage, but in living one's own truth. Richard Pryor and Marlon Brando lived behind masks for years. But on that night in 1976, two weary souls found each other and were free for a brief moment. This story is in their memory, to the real people beneath their masks.